Welcome to Libyth. Every text worth returning to has a layer underneath its plot, and the Kogo Shūi is unusual in how cleanly you can separate that underneath layer from the surface action sitting on top of it, because the surface action here is, frankly, modest. On the literal level, the Kogo Shūi is a ritual history. It records the deeds of a divine ancestor, the descent of a clan, the broad sweep of national mythological history, and finally a specific administrative complaint about neglected ceremonial precedent, submitted by a court official to an emperor in the year 807. If you read it only at this level, you come away with a document that resembles a hereditary house's genealogical record fused with a formal court petition, useful as a primary source for historians of high-end ritual administration, but not obviously a text that should still be occupying our attention 12 centuries later. The literal content, on its own, explains why specialists in early Japanese religious history read this text. It does not explain why anyone else should. What makes the Kogo Shūi worth that wider attention is the second layer sitting just beneath the ritual history, a layer that is never stated directly, but that the entire text is structured around. A meditation on the relationship between memory and writing, between oral transmission and textual authority, and on the deeper question of who actually gets to decide what the past was. This is not a theme Hayarnari announces. It emerges from the shape of the document itself, from the specific way it positions its own act of writing as both a rescue and a surrender. The text opens by describing, with real and unmistakable feeling, a world in which tradition was carried entirely in memory, passed by voice from generation to generation, before the introduction of writing gave the elite culture of the court a new, and in Hayarnari's framing, more frivolous way of relating to its own past. And then, having mourned that older world, the text proceeds to do the one thing that older world never needed and never permitted. It writes the tradition down. The Kogo Shūi is, in this sense, an act of translation between two entirely different regimes of authority. The regime of inherited memory, which depends on trust in the unbroken chain of transmission itself, and the regime of the written record, which depends on the document's ability to be checked, compared, and cited against other documents. Hayarnari is using the second regime to defend the first, and there is something close to tragic in that, because the very act of writing the oral tradition down is also, irreversibly, the act that finishes killing it as oral tradition. Once it exists on the page, it no longer needs to live in anyone's memory, and a mode of cultural transmission that had survived for centuries effectively completes its own extinction in the act of being preserved. It's worth dwelling further on what this transition actually cost, in concrete terms, for an institution like the Inbe clan, because the abstract description of oral culture giving way to written culture can make the loss sound gentler than it actually was for the people living through it. An oral tradition does not simply get transcribed and continue on, unchanged, in a new medium. The skills required to be a trustworthy keeper of oral memory, disciplined recitation, careful generational transmission, the social structures that ensured a chain of memory remained unbroken across decades, are not the same skills required to be a trustworthy custodian of a written archive. Once the court's confidence shifted decisively toward writing as the superior guarantee of accuracy, the specific expertise the Inbe clan had spent generations cultivating stopped being the scarce, valuable resource it had once been. Anyone literate could now, in principle, consult a written record without needing to trust any particular family's memory at all. This is the deeper economic logic sitting underneath the cultural mourning in the text's opening pages. Hayar is not simply nostalgic for an older aesthetic of transmission. He is watching the specific asset his clan's entire social value had been built around become obsolete, replaced by a technology that any sufficiently funded institution, not just his own hereditary house, could deploy. This tension between rescuing a tradition and finally ending it by fixing it in writing is the emotional and philosophical engine running underneath the entire text, and it deserves to be taken seriously as a genuine intellectual problem rather than simply as background color. Every culture that has made the transition from oral to written transmission has faced some version of this paradox, the sense that the technology capable of preserving the past most durably is also the technology that changes, permanently, the relationship a living community has with that past. Once something is written, it stops being remembered in the active sense and starts being merely consulted. The Kogo Shūi captures that hinge moment with unusual clarity, precisely because its author has such a personal, institutional stake in the older mode of transmission. He is not a detached observer commenting on a cultural shift happening to someone else. He is a member of a clan whose entire claim to relevance rested on being the trustworthy keepers of memory, watching that basis for relevance dissolve in real time as the written record became the only form of authority the court still fully respected, and responding to that dissolution by doing the one thing guaranteed to finish it off completely. Sitting on top of this memory versus writing tension is the more directly political question the text keeps circling: who gets to control the past? This is the question that connects the philosophical layer of the Kogo Shūi back to its concrete political circumstances, because in the world Hayar occupied, controlling the past was not an abstract intellectual exercise. It was the single most effective tool available for justifying or contesting present arrangements of power. If the present order of court ritual, with the Nakatomi clan ascendant and the Inbe clan diminished, can be shown to follow naturally and inevitably from the divine order established at the very beginning of things, then that present order becomes very difficult to challenge. It is simply the unfolding of what was always meant to be. But if the divine order itself can be shown to have been misremembered, abridged, or selectively transmitted by the official chroniclers, then the present arrangement loses its claim to inevitability. It becomes, instead, one possible outcome among several, contingent on which version of the past happened to get written down and preserved. This is exactly the opening the Kogo Shūi exploits. By presenting itself not as a contradiction of the official chronicles, but as a supplement to them, gleanings, things gathered up that the official record happened to omit, it manages to destabilize the inevitability of the present political order without ever directly attacking the legitimacy of the chronicles that order depends on. It simply suggests, patiently and respectfully, that the official record was incomplete, and that completing it changes the picture in ways that happen to favor the party doing the completing. Was the Inbe clan's decline actually unjust, in any sense that would have meaning outside the political contest itself? Or was it simply political reality, dressed up in the language of injustice, because that language was the only register available for contesting a political reality you have already lost the power to contest by force? The text obviously wants us to believe the former. Every rhetorical choice in it is built to support the claim that something true and sacred has been wrongly neglected, that restoration rather than innovation is being requested. But notice what the text cannot do, and structurally cannot do, given when and by whom it was written. It cannot offer us any vantage point outside the Inbe clan's own interest from which to evaluate that claim. We have no surviving Nakatomi rebuttal preserved with anything like the same care. No neutral administrative record carefully weighing both clans' claims against each other and reaching an independent judgment. What we have is one side's case, made with real skill, in a dispute where both sides had everything to gain from controlling the narrative, and where the narrative-shaping side that ultimately succeeded politically, the Nakatomi and their Fujiwara patrons, had far less need to write anything down to defend a position they were already winning by other means. This asymmetry should make us cautious about adopting the Kogo Shūi's framing too completely, even as we take its content seriously as one valuable angle on the historical truth. The text is evidence. It is not a verdict. And recognizing that distinction is itself one of the more valuable interpretive skills this text can teach, almost as a byproduct of being read carefully at all. It's worth drawing this thread all the way out to the present, because the question the Kogo Shūi asks about who controls the past is not a question that became obsolete once the imperial court stopped mattering as a center of religious authority. Every era produces its own version of the official chronicle and its own version of the shadow text contesting it. And the mechanism is recognizably the same even when the institutions and the technology have changed beyond recognition. Accept the dominant version as settled, or find some way to construct a counter-account using whatever cultural authority remains available, and submit it not as rebellion, but as correction. Framed in whatever language, the dominant institution still finds legible and worth taking seriously. The specific tools differ wildly across time and place. The underlying structure of the move, a minority account using the dominant order's own vocabulary to stake a claim within that order rather than against it, repeats with remarkable consistency, which is exactly why a document this specific and this old can still feel, on close reading, oddly contemporary. There's a connective thread here that reaches well beyond Heian Japan, and it's worth drawing out explicitly, because it's what gives the Kogo Shūi its relevance to anyone, anywhere, thinking seriously about how history gets made. Every culture that has ever had a dominant historical narrative has also had, somewhere just outside that narrative's official boundary, a minority account written by whoever lost the contest that the dominant narrative now retroactively justifies. Sometimes those minority accounts survive only in fragments, in oral memory, in folklore dismissed as superstition by the educated classes of their own time. Occasionally, as with the Kogo Shūi, they survive as full, deliberate, carefully constructed documents, preserved precisely because the people who produced them had enough institutional standing. Not enough to win the original argument, but enough to get their version of events formally recorded and transmitted alongside the official histories that defeated them. This is the broader pattern the Kogo Shūi exemplifies. History as self-defense, the practice of using the same mythological or historical vocabulary that legitimizes the dominant order to construct a counterclaim within that order's own terms, rather than from outside it. It is a strategy available only to parties who have lost politically, but not yet lost their access to the cultural and religious language the winners also depend on. And it produces, almost by definition, some of the richest and most revealing documents we have for understanding what a society's official story leaves out. It's worth pausing on a question that the comparison to other shadow histories naturally raises. Why did this particular shadow history succeed, in the limited but real sense of surviving and being read for over 1,000 years, when so many others vanished without leaving any comparable trace? Part of the answer lies in something already discussed: the Kogo Shūi's genuine value as a record of ritual practice and mythological detail unavailable elsewhere. The credibility purchased through demonstrated expertise rather than assertion alone. But part of the answer also lies in timing, in the fact that Nari was writing at precisely the moment when writing itself was becoming the only form of memory the court still fully trusted. A clan with a grievance a century earlier might have had no comparable way to make its case durable. No guarantee that an oral protest, however eloquent, would survive being passed down even one or two further generations with its force intact. A clan with the same grievance a century later might have found that the written record had already calcified so completely around the official chronicles that no supplementary account, however carefully argued, could expect a fair hearing. Nari's text exists in the narrow window where writing had become available and trusted as a tool, but had not yet become so totalizing in its authority that a respectfully framed alternative account stood no chance of being taken seriously. This is not an accident of good fortune so much as a structural condition the text itself describes and depends on. The very transition from oral to written culture that the Kogo Shūi mourns is also the transition that makes the Kogo Shūi's own survival possible, since without writing, this particular act of gleaning would have had no vessel sturdy enough to carry it across the centuries that followed. This raises one more thread worth pulling, because it connects the philosophical content of the text back to something close to a paradox at the heart of historical writing in general. Not just in Heian Japan, but in any tradition that has ever produced both official chronicles and the dissenting accounts that sit alongside them. The official record always has a structural advantage that has nothing to do with truth and everything to do with timing and institutional backing. It gets written first, with the resources of the state behind it, and it gets to define the baseline against which every subsequent account, however well evidenced, will be measured as either confirming or deviating from the established picture. The Kogo Shūi never had the option of being received as a neutral account on equal footing with the Nihongi. It was always going to be read as the variant, the supplement, the gleaning, precisely because it arrived second, and because the party that arrived first held the institutional power to make its version the default. This asymmetry is not unique to Heian Japan. It describes a structural feature of how historical authority gets distributed in any society where writing and political power are concentrated in the same hands. And recognizing that pattern in the Kogo Shūi is part of what makes the text useful as a lens for thinking about historical authority anywhere, not simply as an artifact of one specific court dispute that ceased to matter politically many centuries ago. What you should carry forward from the Kogo Shūi, once you've set aside its specific gods and its specific 9th century grievances about ritual precedent, is this recognition. Every official history has a shadow history, written by whoever came out on the losing side of whatever contest the official history now exists to justify. Most of the time, that shadow history disappears, unrecorded, unremembered, lost along with the political fortunes of the people who might have written it down. Occasionally, as happened here, the losing side retains just enough standing, just enough access to the shared religious and cultural vocabulary of its own era, to write its version down and have that version preserved alongside, rather than instead of, the official account it was contesting. The Kogo Shūi is that rare surviving case, a shadow text granted the unusual privilege of religious authority, treated for over 1,000 years not as the bitter complaint of a defeated faction, but as a sacred record in its own right, sitting quietly beside the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, making its case again to every new reader who happens to take the time to notice what it's actually doing underneath the myth. There is something worth sitting with in the simple fact that this case is still being made, 12 centuries on, to an audience that has no stake whatsoever in the outcome. Nobody watching or reading about the Kogo Shūi today has any reason to favor the Inbe over the Nakatomi, any more than they have a reason to favor one side or the other in any number of forgotten court disputes from this period that left no comparable trace. And yet the document keeps finding readers willing to take its argument seriously on its own terms, not because the original grievance still matters, but because the structure of the argument itself, the patient layering of genealogy into history into petition, the careful restraint that turns potential accusation into respectful correction, remains genuinely impressive as a piece of persuasive writing regardless of who eventually held court rank in 9th century Japan. Not the verdict it was trying to win, which nobody alive has any reason to care about anymore, but the method it used to try to win it. A method that turns out to illuminate something durable about how power, memory, and myth have always been tangled together, in every century that has produced both a winning side and a side left holding nothing but its own carefully gathered memory of how things were supposed to be. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.